I made the right choice. That's what everyone told me. That's what the facts supported. That's what logic demanded. And that's exactly why it destroyed me. At the time, there were two paths in front of me. One was uncertain, risky, emotionally charged. The other was stable, respectable, defensible. One asked me to trust something fragile inside myself. The other asked me to be sensible. I chose sensible. People congratulated me. They said I was mature. They said I had avoided a mistake. They said I would thank myself later. I repeated those words to myself until they sounded true. The problem with choosing the right path is that it rarely feels wrong immediately. It feels calm, organized, responsible. It comes with reassurance instead of resistance. So when the first discomfort appeared, I ignored it. When the second appeared, I explained it away. By the time I realized something fundamental was missing, the choice had already hardened into a life. I told myself that doubt was normal. That regret was just fear of commitment. That every meaningful life includes sacrifice. I framed my unease as immaturity I needed to outgrow. I was very good at rationalizing pain. The path I chose didn't hurt me loudly. It didn't punish me. It didn't collapse. It rewarded me just enough to keep me compliant. Progress came in small, predictable steps. Each one moved me further away from the version of myself that had hesitated at the crossroads. That version faded quietly. I didn't notice when I stopped checking in with myself. I didn't notice when my instincts went silent. I didn't notice when I began making decisions based solely on how defensible they were. I became excellent at explaining my life. I stopped asking whether it felt like mine. People admired my discipline. They told me I was doing things the smart way. They trusted my judgment because I always chose what made sense. What they didn't see was how empty making sense can feel when it replaces meaning. I had chosen a life that could be justified from every angle except the one that mattered most. Inside, something felt postponed. As if I were living a preparatory version of my life, waiting for the real one to begin after I finished being responsible. But responsibility doesn't end. It expands. The more I invested in the path I had chosen, the harder it became to question it. Each year added weight. Each commitment added friction. Turning back began to feel not just impractical, but immoral. How could I leave now, after everything I had built? How could I admit that the right choice had been wrong for me? How could I disappoint the people who had celebrated my decision? Those questions trapped me more effectively than fear ever had. I started measuring my life by external markers: progress, stability, approval, because internally, there was nothing to measure anymore. I wasn't unhappy enough to justify change. I wasn't fulfilled enough to feel alive. I existed in between. That's the most dangerous place to live. At night, I sometimes imagine the other path. Not in detail, just as a sensation. A different rhythm. A different weight in my chest. I didn't romanticize it. I just wondered who I would be if I had trusted myself instead of the rules. Those thoughts felt disloyal. So I buried them. I became very good at staying busy. At filling time. At convincing myself that restlessness was a character flaw. I told myself that adults don't chase feelings. They build lives. What no one tells you is that you can build a life that slowly dismantles you. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in through small moments of disconnect. Laughing at the right times without feeling it. Achieving things that felt strangely hollow. Reaching milestones that brought relief instead of joy. I began to understand something terrifying: I wasn't failing at the life I had chosen. I was succeeding. And success was making escape impossible. One evening, after a day that looked perfect from the outside, I sat alone and tried to imagine doing this for the rest of my life. Not improving it. Not changing it. Just continuing. The image didn't scare me. It numbed me. That's when I realized the truth I had been avoiding: choosing the right path doesn't guarantee it's your path. And the longer you stay on it, the harder it becomes to admit that you're lost. Because walking away from the wrong choice looks like bravery. Walking away from the right one looks like insanity. I didn't know yet what I would do. But I knew one thing with painful clarity. The life I was living made sense to everyone. Except me. Once I accepted that the life I was living made sense to everyone except me, the silence inside grew louder. Not dramatic. Not panicked. Persistent. It followed me through ordinary days, through routines that once felt grounding and now felt rehearsed. I moved efficiently, spoke thoughtfully, made decisions that aligned perfectly with expectations. On the surface, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. I started noticing how often I chose things based on how irreversible they were. Long-term commitments felt safer than flexible ones. Fixed plans felt better than open possibilities. I preferred decisions that closed doors instead of ones that left them ajar. At the time, I told myself this was discipline. In truth, it was fear. Fear that if I left any space unfilled, something unwanted might emerge. A question. A doubt. A truth I wasn't prepared to face. So I filled my life completely. Responsibilities multiplied. Expectations solidified. People came to rely on me not emotionally, not intensely, but structurally. I was dependable. Predictable. Safe. That safety became my prison. The more invested others became in my stability, the less permission I felt to disrupt it. My life wasn't just mine anymore, it had become part of a shared system. My consistency supported other people's plans, other people's sense of order. Walking away now wouldn't just change my life. It would shake theirs. That thought kept me where I was longer than anything else. I began to see how the right choice protects itself. It surrounds you with validation. It rewards you with approval. It reassures you every time doubt appears. And doubt did appear. Often. But I learned to handle it the same way I handled everything else, quietly, internally, without letting it affect the structure of my life. I tried to fix the problem from the inside instead of questioning the path itself. I read. I reflected. I reframed. I told myself that fulfillment was something you cultivated, not something you chased. That peace required acceptance. That discomfort was the price of maturity. Those ideas sounded wise. They were also a form of self-betrayal. Because the discomfort I felt wasn't resistance to responsibility. It was resistance to erasure. The harder I tried to adapt, the more disconnected I became. I felt like I was performing a life instead of inhabiting it. Like an actor who had learned the lines so well they forgot why the play existed. There were moments when the mask slipped. A comment from someone who assumed my future was obvious. A plan made on my behalf without asking. A compliment that praised my restraint instead of my presence. Each time, something inside me recoiled. I realized I had become a symbol of the right choice, not a person. That identity was suffocating. I couldn't leave without rewriting the story everyone told about me. And I wasn't sure who I would be without that story. So I stayed and tried to numb myself to the misalignment. That's when the real damage began. I stopped wanting things. Not consciously, subtly. Desire felt dangerous now. It threatened the coherence of the life I had built. Wanting something different implied dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction implied error. I had chosen correctly. I wasn't allowed to want more. So my wants grew quiet. I replaced them with routines, productivity, and long-term thinking. I focused on outcomes instead of experiences. I measured my days by efficiency instead of presence. People praised my composure. Inside, I felt hollow. I began to understand something unsettling: The right choice doesn't always fail you immediately. Sometimes it succeeds so thoroughly that it leaves no room for escape. By the time you realize it's wrong for you, it has already become the foundation of your life. And foundations aren't easy to abandon. There was a moment late, unavoidable, when I felt the weight of that truth fully. I was listening to someone talk excitedly about a decision they were about to make. A risky one. A choice that didn't make sense on paper but felt alive to them. They asked what I thought. I heard myself respond with caution. With logic. With all the reasons they should be careful, strategic, sensible. As I spoke, I felt something fracture. I realized I was no longer just living my own compromise. I was exporting it. I was teaching fear to sound like wisdom. I was validating restraint over honesty. I was reinforcing the very logic that had trapped me. That realization was unbearable. I understood then that staying on the right path wasn't neutral anymore. It was active harm. Not just to me, but to the version of myself that might have existed, and to anyone who believed me when I spoke. I couldn't undo the choice I had made. But I could stop pretending it was enough. The question was no longer should I leave, the question was who will I become if I don't. That question followed me everywhere. It echoed in moments of success that felt empty. In plans that extended endlessly forward without touching anything real. In the quiet understanding that I had optimized my life for safety at the cost of meaning. I realized that the right path had taught me how to survive. It had never taught me how to live. And once that truth settled, I knew I couldn't stay much longer without disappearing completely. Leaving the right path did not feel like liberation. It felt like treason. Not against people, against logic, against identity, against the story that had kept my life coherent for so long. I had spent years proving, to myself and everyone else, that I was sensible, disciplined, reliable. Walking away from that didn't look like growth. It looked like collapse. There was no single moment where I stood up and declared anything. No dramatic turning point. What happened instead was quieter and more frightening. I stopped defending the life I was living. When people praised it, I didn't feel proud anymore. When they assumed my future, I didn't correct them, but I felt a physical resistance inside. When I imagined continuing indefinitely, my body reacted before my mind did. Tight chest. Shallow breath. A heaviness that felt less like fear and more like warning. I realized then that my body had known the truth long before I allowed my mind to catch up. The hardest part wasn't deciding to leave. It was accepting that there would be no version of the story where I looked reasonable to everyone. Leaving the wrong path makes you brave. Leaving the right one makes you suspect. People want explanations that fit their worldview. They want clean narratives: growth, healing, ambition, failure. What I had didn't fit any of those. I chose correctly, and it cost me myself is not a story people know how to hear. So I stopped trying to make it sound acceptable. I didn't leave all at once. I dismantled my life carefully, almost respectfully. I untied myself from structures that no longer held me. I let go of roles that existed only because I had never questioned them. Each step felt both terrifying and strangely quiet. There was grief not just for what I was losing, but for how long it had taken me to recognize the loss. I grieved the version of myself who had believed discipline would eventually turn into fulfillment. Who thought endurance was proof of character. I had been wrong. Endurance without alignment doesn't strengthen you. It erases you. After I left, people asked what I was running toward. They expected a clear alternative, a new goal, a new passion, a better plan. I didn't have one. That terrified them more than my leaving. But here's what I learned in that emptiness: you don't always leave because you know where you're going. Sometimes you leave because you finally understand where you are. The aftermath wasn't easy. There were moments when I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. When the certainty I had abandoned felt tempting again. when safety whispered that I could still go back. But something had changed. I could no longer unknow what I knew. I had lived the version of life that made sense. I had followed the rules. I had done everything right. And I had learned, at great cost, that correctness is not the same thing as truth. Truth is quieter. It doesn't convince. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't always justify itself. It simply refuses to be ignored. I don't tell this story to romanticize leaving. Walking away from the right path doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't promise success. It doesn't fix the years you lost while convincing yourself you were fine. What it gives you is authorship. The ability to say, this life is mine, even if I don't fully understand it yet. I live differently now. Not recklessly. Not heroically. More honestly. I choose based on resonance instead of defensibility. I allow myself to want things that don't make sense on paper. I accept uncertainty as the price of integrity. There are still days when regret visits me. Not regret for leaving but for how long I stayed after I knew. That regret doesn't punish me anymore. It instructs me. Because here is the truth I learned too late to make it painless, but early enough to make it matter: you can do everything right. And still lose yourself. You can follow the correct path. And arrive somewhere you don't exist. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you will ever do is walk away from the life everyone agrees is perfect for you. I chose the right path. And then I chose to leave it. Not because I was sure of what came next, but because staying meant disappearing completely. And that was the one cost I was no longer willing to pay.